Really wonderful to see everybody, and what a super turnout for today. My name is Polly Gardner, and I'm a CQ fellow, and I also help to coordinate the public seminar series. And I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like us to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. And while we meet on this virtual platform, it's also important to acknowledge that we are all living on ancestral lands and unceded territories of Indigenous people across the country and indeed around the world. We make this acknowledgement to show our gratitude and to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improve relationships between our nations and our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. So the plan for today is to start with some introductions, and then our presenter, Katie Ma, will speak for approximately 45 minutes. And then we'll open it up to question and answer and discussion. And I hope we can stay. It'll take approximately 90 minutes. And hopefully you can stay for the discussion and question and answer, as well as the presentation today. Just a reminder that the session is being recorded. And during the presentation, please make sure that you're muted, and also that your cameras and videos are turned off. We'll ask you to turn those back on again when we start the question and discussion. We will not be monitoring the chat during the presentation, but we will use the chat at the end, as well as the hand raising tool when we get into the questions and answers. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the chair of the Joan Eakin Award for Methodological Excellence in a Qualitative Doctoral Dissertation Committee, Dr. Craig Dale, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Polly, for the introduction. It's my great pleasure to join you all today. And on behalf of the CQ Doctoral Dissertation Award Committee members, Dr. Jennifer Poole and Naomi Thulian, it's a pleasure to be here for Dr. Ma's talk on theory and drawing and analysis. Over the last few days, I've had the pleasure of revisiting Dr. Ma's dissertation and was quickly reminded as to why this research won the 2020-2021 Joan Eakin Award for Methodological Excellence and a Qualitative Doctoral Dissertation. The research provides a compelling examination of how children experience concussion using the post-structural theory of Michel Foucault and a critical qualitative arts-based approach, including participant drawing and semi-structured interviews. In using post-structuralist theory, Dr. Ma was able to advance an account that competes with biomedical truths about concussion and of children, which arguably dominate the scholarly field of concussion research. The introduction of a pediatric concussion discourse specifically permits us to consider how a convergence of discourses, namely risk, childhood mobility, and responsibility, circulate a kind of accountability to act in accordance with expert advice emerging from the state and other powerful institutions. However, it's the marriage of theory and conceptual framework and a critical arts-based design that truly impressed the awards committee, as this achieved a congruence that is often quite difficult to achieve in research. Dr. Ma clearly signposts a position within the critical social science paradigm and a paradigmatic practice of questioning and making explicit, the taken for granted assumptions underlying the field of pediatric concussion. These assumptions include the way children are considered as knowledge producers, their credibility as research participants, and how children can both engage in perchance resist accountability to govern themselves in the way expected of dominant discourses. The research culminates in a new understanding of pediatric concussion, not only as a biomedical phenomenon, but also as a social phenomenon. Throughout the dissertation, one repeatedly encounters an engaging reflexivity and a powerful example of the creative presence of the researcher. Reflexive memos document the interplay between the choices all researchers must make, the data produced, and analytic thinking about that data. What it folds is an amazing example of a researcher actively questioning their own assumptions about children as research participants, what children shared through artwork and interview, and why it might have been shared. In sequence, the creative process of writing emerges as a method of inquiry and discovery unto itself. In summary, I can say that Dr. Ma's dissertation is sophisticated, timely, and highly relevant, and I encourage you all to access this important work. We're grateful that this research was conducted and submitted for the award, as it is both invigorating and encouraging. It all pushes us forward to be better researchers. Thank you for the opportunity to say a few words of introduction, and I ask you to join me in warm welcoming Dr. Katie Mell.
Thank you very much, Craig. Excuse me. What a confidence boost to hear written words about yourself. As Craig said, I'm pretty reflexive and open in my writing, and so I'm going to do the same here and let you all know that I really respect all of you as an audience, and so I am a little nervous, so please do bear with me. Okay. Just going to switch over to my slides here, just 1 second. Okay. And Polly, just type in if there's anything funny going on with my slides, please. Okay, here we go. So good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking Polly for all of her behind the scenes work in getting us here, and Tenzin as well. Of course, I'd like to thank my doctoral supervisor, Dr. Nick Reed, and committee members, Drs. Deb Cameron and Brenda Gladstone, as well as my participants and their families, without whom none of this research would have been possible. And finally, a huge thank you to CQ, not only for hosting this event and this prestigious award, but for providing the teaching and learning that I needed to get here today, as well as this incredibly supportive community of practice. I'm so pleased to be here to speak with you today about my doctoral research, and particularly about how I approach that research methodologically. This is a luxury that we are sometimes not afforded when trying to publish our work, but that I think, and that I'm certain many of you in this virtual room think, is integral to advancing the depth and integrity of qualitative health research. Before getting started, I'd like to take a few minutes to position myself and then to pick this title apart a little bit. So I'm currently a postdoctoral associate at Western University in the Faculty of Health Sciences, and I completed my doctoral work in the Rehabilitation Sciences Institute at the University of Toronto, while affiliated with Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital in the Concussion Center, it provides clinical services as well as hosts a large research lab. I identify as an interdisciplinary critical qualitative researcher who combines social studies of childhood, health science theory, and social theory to produce applied work with implications across sectors. I'm also an occupational therapist with an educational and clinical background in nursing. And through this training, I was socialized into biomedicine and was formerly very at home here and in the positivist paradigm. And so I entered my doctoral work with a specific way of regarding the world, reality, and knowledge, and in thinking about research. And in the very early days of my doctoral studies, I had an awakening of sorts where I came to recognize my clinical lens as a very specific way of looking at the world. And I began to recognize my onto epistemological assumptions as assumptions. This was very uncomfortable, but freeing, and allowed me to start undertaking the hard work of undoing those assumptions, of looking through, but also around that clinical lens to arrive at a place where I could begin the work that I'll share with you today through this presentation, which is titled, Can We Stop Calling It, with it being drawing this method cute? Years ago now, one of my mentors, Dr. Brenda Gladstone, encouraged me to always title my writing. And I believe this is something that she learned from Joan Eakin, to allow me to document how I was thinking about my topic or concept at the time of the writing, and to serve as a record of the conceptual and methodological evolution of my work over time. And so I'd like to pause here for a moment to explain this title, because it's become meaningful to me as I've been preparing this talk, providing me insight into how my understanding of drawing as method has changed over time, from a participatory and child-friendly method to an essential part of my work. Early on in my doctoral studies, when I spoke of my plan to use drawing to generate data with young people, I started noticing something, this look of sorts that I can't quite describe, which is funny for somebody who writes all day, but that was often accompanied by an "oh" or "ah." And nobody outright called my method cute, but to me, it was very much implied, as was the notion that this research was less serious than, less valued than, or maybe even easier than other research, with that other being positivist and quantitative research. And that enraged me to no end, which will come as no surprise to anyone who knows me personally or professionally. When I look back now upon that reaction, I do wonder if, as a newly reformed positivist, I was perhaps projecting my insecurities, my unease with taking up this less familiar method. That said, I don't regret that projection because it motivated me to do more, to make not only a substantive contribution to the field of pediatric concussion, but to also make a methodological contribution. And so we arrive back at the beginning to what I'm going to speak about today, how my early, at the time unacknowledged discomfort with drawing as method forced me to think deeply and at length about how and why I was taking up drawing in my work. This afternoon, I'll start by providing a brief introduction to the field of youth concussion and to my doctoral study. And what I really love about the format of these CQ seminars is that I have the time to spend speaking to my theoretical framework, my methods of data generation and analysis. Because of this, I won't delve too much into the findings or implications, since our shared interest today isn't youth concussion, but methodology. So I'll spend more time on how I theorize drawing and how I theorize the data that I generated with young people. We'll then walk through two empirical examples together before coming to a provocation or challenge that I'm thinking through and that I invite your opinions on. And we'll end, as these sessions always do, with some discussion. Before we dive in, I have one quick note on flow. So while this agenda appears linear, I'm going to rebel here a little bit and bend the academic convention of linearity somewhat, choosing instead to represent my process as it unfolded, telling rather than hiding the circling and maneuvering that is required of qualitative research. And so a better representation of today's outline is probably closer to this. I'll move back and forth between method and theory, using my work to highlight key points, as well as challenges that I encountered along the way. And where possible, I'll share with you how I address those challenges, while acknowledging that I continue to grapple with questions of drawing as method today. This non-linear presentation style is an experiment of sorts, so please bear with me, but it's one that I think will speak to this audience of critical or critical curious and qualitative or qualitative friendly scholars. What will remain consistent in all of this back and forth and non-linearity is that I'll return always to theory as an orienting point. Not only because I think this will be helpful to you as an audience, but because this was my process. Whenever I felt bogged down or stuck or was unsure of where to go next, if I ever wondered if what I was seeing in my data analysis was worth pursuing, I returned always to theory. So the study, excuse me. My doctoral study is titled, that's a bit of a mouthful, Freaked Out by Pediatric Concussion, an exploration of drawing and interview data produced by children at risk of and living with concussion. In recent years, pediatric concussion has been named a public health crisis in academic and lay spheres, and pediatric concussion research has been identified as a priority. Despite the explosion of research in the area, the question of how concussion is understood by those most affected by it, namely young people, remains largely unexplored. The result is a decidedly narrow conceptualization of concussion, an inadequate representation of children's perspectives, and an impoverished base of scholarly knowledge from which to develop clinical services for young people following concussion. There's an acknowledged need in the field to expand how we understand concussion, develop a more nuanced understanding of its effects on the everyday lives of children. I knew upon entering this study that meeting this need would require me to do research differently, to think outside of the positivist paradigm that I was so comfortable in, and to include children in research in more profound ways. And so with the ultimate goal of improving the practices available to health practitioners working with children at risk of and living with concussion, I set out with the following aim: to investigate, challenge, and transform conventional ways of thinking and knowing about concussion and children. My goal with this study was to make it impossible to continue thinking of concussion only as a biomedical phenomenon, with biomedical consequences and solutions, and of children only as vulnerable and at risk, to make it impossible to think that our current research and clinical practices are the only way. This goal resonated with the words of Foucault, who said that as soon as one can no longer think things as one formerly thought them, transformation becomes both very urgent, very difficult, and quite possible. And so I turned to Foucault to build a theoretical framework that would guide me in my work, that would push my analysis beyond what children understood about concussion to how they came to understand concussion as they did, to how pervasive societal ways of thinking and knowing about concussion and children, or discourses, shaped how children experience concussion. Now, again, I'll ask you to bear with me a little as I delve into my theoretical framework, which I've tried to distill down to one slide, but that could be the subject of this talk all on its own. Foucault described discourses as practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. In other words, objects do not exist prior to or outside of discourse, but are constructed in particular ways by discourse. For example, an object or an act is not inherently risky, but is constituted as such by discourse, or more specifically, by risk discourse. To understand how discourse works or functions, we have to understand the nature of discourse. Discourse is not autonomous, but productive, in that it always produces something else, whether further discourse or subject position. Discourse circulates throughout society through individuals and institutions to achieve specific aims, including the maintenance of particular knowledges as dominant. And in this way, discourse also constrains. By circulating only those knowledges deemed worthy of attention, discourse constrains what can be said or known about a particular phenomenon, or how one can think and act when encountering that phenomenon. To understand how discourse circulates to produce these effects, it's necessary to understand how power and knowledge function. Traditional views of power position power as hierarchical, operating from top down and requiring punishment to function. Foucault, however, didn't hold these same views. Instead, he believed power to operate through the creation of expert knowledges about individuals and societies, which, like discourse, serve to shape how individuals and groups of individuals can think and act. Here, power and knowledge exist in an intimate relationship, expressed through the formula power knowledge, wherein the exercise of power perpetually creates knowledge, and knowledge constantly induces the effects of power. This power-knowledge nexus circulates through a diffuse system of relations, spread throughout society, for example, through the family, the education system, and the health system. Due to the nature of discourse, the way it produces, circulates, and constrains, discourse cannot be studied in isolation, but must be studied where it produces an effect, for example, on the subject. Notably, Foucault rejected the notion of a stable and pre-given subject or self, believing instead that the self can only ever be a subject, constituted as such by historically situated discourse and power knowledge. Of note, while individuals are at times acted upon and created as particular types of subjects by society, its institutions, expert knowledges, and discursive practices, they also act upon themselves, creating themselves as subjects of a desired way of being. Now, this doesn't imply that they aren't influenced in these actions by discourse, but rather that they've internalized discourse to the extent that its effects are experienced as voluntary. And here the productive nature of discourse becomes evident. Discourse produces individuals who believe themselves to be and who shape themselves as the types of subjects desired in a given society. Building this theoretical framework provided me a way of understanding the social world in which pediatric concussion was constructed in very specific and limited ways, the mechanisms through which pediatric concussion was constructed as such, and how children encountered and responded to concussion as a social phenomenon, as well as a biomedical phenomenon in the context of their everyday lives. So in my work, I studied the effects of one particular discourse, which I've named the Pediatric Concussion Discourse, on the everyday lives of children at risk of and living with concussion. The Pediatric Concussion Discourse, or PCD, is a Foucauldian framing of the field of pediatric concussion that I constructed through my interaction with the substantive literature, theoretical literature, and my knowledge of pediatric concussion as an area of clinical practice. Specifically, the PCD is a risk discourse that relies on the pervasiveness of discourses of childhood vulnerability and of responsibility in relation to risk to exert its effects. In this way, the pediatric concussion discourse is a convergence of dominant discourses, which, when combined, have considerable effect on how children can think and act when they encounter concussion, as well as what they can know and say about concussion in research. In this convergence, the child is produced as perpetually and inescapably at risk of concussion, as vulnerable by nature, and thus in need of protection by those considered less vulnerable, namely adults. At the same time, discourses of risk construct the management of risk in contemporary Western society as an individual responsibility. When the individual is a child, however, this responsibility is shared between the child and their family. By constructing the child as inherently vulnerable and especially at risk of concussion, and as at least partially responsible for managing their risk in relation to concussion, the pediatric concussion discourse shapes how children can think and act in relation to concussion. It also defines how adults who are engaged with children in their everyday lives, for instance, in research, clinical practice, or the family, can think about, know about, and act in relation to children at risk of and living with concussion. In contemplating concussion through my conceptual framework, as well as through the pediatric concussion discourse, I became able to ask the following research questions. How does the pediatric concussion discourse produce and constrain how children can think and act in relation to concussion? And how do children at risk of and living with concussion respond to the pediatric concussion discourse? That is, how do they reproduce, negotiate, and or resist the pediatric concussion discourse and its assumptions of risk, childhood vulnerability, and responsibility? Now to the fun part. To explore these questions, I employed a critical arts-based research design and used the following methods to generate data with participants. First, each participant generated a drawing depicting how they understood concussion at the time of the study. Participants without a history of concussion produced a drawing in response to the phrase, "When I hear the word concussion, I," which you'll see on the piece of paper, or representation of a piece of paper that appears at the back. Those with a history of concussion produced a drawing in response to the phrase, "Before I had my concussion, I," and another in response to the phrase, "Now I." Next, I invited each participant to engage in a semi-structured interview with me, where we explored their drawing, what it meant. Oh, pardon me, sorry. Here we go. Where we talked about their drawing, the content of that drawing as they understood it, as well as the intended audience. Well, here's one of our detours. This was an important detour for me, which I encountered in the midst of data generation. I was amassing all of this data, and I knew that I was onto something, but I didn't know what that something was, where it was coming from, or where it would lead me. I was starting to feel overwhelmed by the amount of data I had. I generated data with 43 young people between 6 and 18 years of age. I knew that theorizing my data, looking at it with and through my theoretical framework, would give me that in that I was seeking. But I also had a sense that I needed to think more about drawing as method, or to remind myself of how I regarded drawing. How is it the same or different from words-based data? was it, and in what ways? Drawing in research is often taken up as a participatory method, as a means to achieve innovation in a study, or in the case of research with children, as a so-called accessible or child-friendly method. My point today isn't to delve too deep into these reasons for taking up drawing, or to discuss the critiques that follow these reasonings. But I do want to share with you how and why my understanding of drawing as method has evolved over time. When I first started working with drawing, I conceptualized it as a participatory method, a means through which to engage young people for one of the first times in the co-production of knowledge about a topic that they had rarely been consulted on before. But there were other reasons. My participants included young people with a history of concussion as well as those without. And from a practical standpoint, I believe that while insights regarding concussion might be accessible to those with lived experience of concussion, I didn't believe similar insights regarding concussion to be as front of mind to those without that lived experience. And so I did not want to rely solely on a method that required an immediate response, as can be the case with words-based methods used alone, but wanted to find a method that allowed participants the time and space to reflect on and construct knowledge about a topic that they may not have thought about explicitly before. Concussion is also, or can be, a very abstract topic. And so I wanted a method that would allow for different kinds of knowledge, the more emotional, abstract, or tacit forms of knowledge that can be generated using arts-based methods, including drawing. And while I knew these to be thoughtful and productive reasons for taking up drawing in the first place, I felt that by considering drawing only in these terms, I was perhaps missing out on all that drawing had to offer, even though I didn't know what that all was. And so I turned to the work of Gillian Rose, cultural geography, who's written a cultural geographer who has written extensively about doing research with visual methods, and Merilys Gilman, a sociologist of health and illness, who extends Rose's thinking to empirical work with women with heart disease, whose work has inspired me early on, but who I'd become somewhat disconnected from when diving into the more procedural aspects of research. I assume this is what Rose and Gilman look like. So Gilman used drawing along with interviewing methods to examine how women who were living with heart disease experienced, understood, and made sense of their condition. Methodologically, Gilman was interested in the process of drawing as a reflective and meaning-making process, wherein each woman constructed knowledge about her drawing through the process of creating it. At the same time, she was interested in each drawing as an analyzable product, offering a representation of how women understood heart disease in the specific time and place of the study, as well as how their past interactions and experiences inform those understandings. Theorizing drawing in this way enabled Gilman as an analyst to gain insight into the multiple and complex ways women made sense of their heart disease, as well as how broader social discourses concerning heart disease shaped these understandings. Like Gilman, I turned to Rose's work in visual cultural studies and methodologies to inform my understanding of drawings generated through research, understanding them as a source of knowledge of the broader social discourses shaping children's understandings of concussion and of themselves in relation to concussion. Of images, including drawings, Rose writes that like the written or spoken word, they articulate discourses and so represent the social world in which they are produced, while at the same time constructing accounts of that social world. By interacting with Rose and Gilman's work, I came to think of drawing not only as an engaging means through which to invite children into research, or as an elicitation device for the interview that followed, but methodologically, as a meaning-making process whereby each child constructed knowledge of concussion through the creation and sharing of their drawing, as an analyzable and interpretable product representing how each child understood concussion in the time and place of the study, and of how social interactions, experiences, and discourses of concussion in children shape those understandings. And importantly, as a means through which to visualize discourse and subjectivity. Excuse me. Theorizing drawing in this way, my method achieved coherence with the Foucauldian-informed theoretical framework I developed within the context of the study, enabling me to examine the broader societal ways of thinking, speaking, and acting that shape children's drawings of concussion. Once I'd clarified for myself all that drawing could offer my study, my data generation, I had to tackle the big question that I've been asked time and time again since taking up drawing, and that I continue to be asked. How do you analyze drawing data anyway? I find this question so tricky to answer depending on the audience, because the answer, not surprisingly, is that it really depends. It depends on your paradigm or worldview, ontology and epistemology. It depends on your theoretical framework, and it all comes back to coherence. This is where having a theoretical framework is absolutely essential, serving as that orienting device that I mentioned earlier, guiding the analyst and where to look. And for me, this meant locating discourse and subjectivity, as I just highlighted. And even though the answer to that question is that it depends, I'm going to provide a little bit of insight into how I analyzed my data, again, maintaining that coherence with my theoretical framework. And you'll notice that there's an asterisk here, because even though I'm speaking mostly to the drawing data, I also regarded the interview data quite similarly. We don't have time to get into sort of all the specifics of that, but just know that I am speaking to both forms of data as I move through the next few slides. To locate discourse and subjectivity in my analysis, I took an overview of all of the data, so all data produced by all participants, before analyzing the interviewing and drawing data separately. And then for each participant, I analyzed their interview data, their drawing data separately, and then explored the relationship between those two forms of data. And in this way, I was able to attend to the diverse ways that discourse was articulated and represented within and across the data. Importantly, I treated all texts as data to be read in the post-structural sense, as a manifestation of those dominant societal ways of thinking that I was interested in. And so I approached the data with an eye toward deconstructing those discourses, revealing the dominant assumptions informing the data. I asked myself not only what does this participant think, but also how has this participant come to think this way? And that question became really important to me as I moved through the data. I also asked specific questions of the data, as is a common analytic device in critical qualitative inquiry. In doing this, I drew again on the work of Rose and on Gilman's work, which, as a reminder, was an adaptation of Rose's work. And this is just a selection of the questions that I asked. About the production of the drawing, I had to attend to the effect of the way that I'd chosen to structure data generation. So as you'll recall, I asked children without a history of concussion to produce only one drawing in response to the phrase "when I hear the word concussion," while asking those with a history of concussion to produce two different drawings to represent what they thought or felt before and after injury, which implied that I almost expected them to speak to me about this change. And that in itself is a discourse that I'm exploring now in my postdoctoral work. Of the drawing as a product, I attended to what was shown as well as what was not. And this became a very fruitful question to me, enabling me to know that while the pediatric concussion discourse would have us expect that the adults in the everyday lives of the children I was conducting my research with would assume some responsibility for protecting those children from the risk of concussion, they were notably absent. That is, adults were notably absent across the data, which provided an important entry point for me into data analysis, enabling a central finding in my work. I asked questions also of the intended audience, which you can see here. And I added some additional questions that were inspired by my theoretical framework, which you can see here. So in an effort to locate discourse in and across the data, I examined not only what children said or the language they used, but also the practices they used when confronted with concussion in their everyday lives. For example, I interrogated the data to understand the strategies children use to obtain knowledge about concussion, how they assessed knowledge as true or false, and relatedly, who they trusted as legitimate sources of knowledge about concussion. I asked questions of the data, such as what discourses must be in operation for this participant to frame concussion as they do. To locate subjectivity in and across the data, I examined how children were constituted as particular types of subjects. For example, I considered how they acted upon themselves to shape themselves as, for example, responsible subjects in their everyday lives, as well as how they presented themselves to me, both in the context of the interview, as well as through their drawing or written response data. Finally, in locating discourse and subjectivity, I was mindful of a common critique leveled at scholars who take up Foucault to study risk, which is that these theorizations focus too much on the discourses and the strategies that circulate risk, and not enough on how people respond to risk-related discourses in the context of their everyday lives. And that was essentially what was driving my study. Now, I shared earlier that I didn't want to miss out on all that I suspected drawing as method had to offer. And in time, I came to understand that essential part of that all the drawing had to offer was the value-added analysis that many of us in this virtual room seek in our work. As Egan and Gladstone wrote in their 2020 paper exploring that exact topic, there are few things as useful as theory for making sense of qualitative data. And so on the following slides, I share an example of how I began to theorize my data through the Foucauldian informed theoretical framework that I shared with you. I'll give everyone a brief moment to look at this drawing. And then I'm going to flip to the next slide, which shows an excerpt of the interview that came after this drawing was generated. And just in case you can't read the text there, it's in the first drawing on the left. It says, in a thought bubble, I'm carefree. And on the right, it says, I'm going to be careful. And then I'll just flip here. Okay, and you can read here, but I'm also going to read aloud because I see that the live transcription is on. So I asked this participant, so do you want to explain to me what the first drawing is on the left-hand side? He responded, it's about before I had my concussion. I was skating and I skated really fast because it was fun. And then after that, I'm more careful now about skating after I had my concussion because it made me think that skating isn't all fun. You can get hurt. That makes a lot of sense. So you can see that on the left-hand side where it says before I had my concussion, your drawing of yourself, you look really happy. He responded, yeah, I look super happy because I thought it was all about fun. It was just fun, fun, fun. And in your thought bubble, it says, I'm carefree. Yeah. And what are these lines around your head here? Like that I'm happy. Okay. Happiness radiating from you. And on the right, you've explained that when it says now somehow you look slower in that picture and it looks like your expression has changed. Can you explain that to me? It's because at first I thought skating was all about fun, but now I see it in a different angle. I see it not just as fun, but also as a threat, I guess. The participant who produced this drawing shared with me that he had a history of concussion, and so that's why he was given this piece of paper with the line down the middle, the same as all participants with a history of concussion. In the top left corner, where it says before I had my concussion, he drew himself as a stick figure, and those are skates that he's wearing, saying, I'm carefree. He has an open body posture with arms spread wide. He's smiling. It's hard to see in this picture, but there are yellow lines that appear to be emanating from his head. In the top, under the phrase the top right, he's drawn himself again as a stick figure on skates, saying, I will be careful. His posture seems more closed. He has a straight line for a mouth, and his eyes appear somehow darker and less animated than the figure on the left. I could talk about this drawing forever, about the specific questions I asked of it, how so much emotion is conveyed through a simple stick figure, how different audiences reacted to this drawing among many drawings, how they were saddened by the loss of innocence of the child, as they put it, how they commented that no child should ever feel this way. and about how this comment in particular made me question, why not? And made me think about how I think about children and about how society also thinks about children. But what I want to focus on today is how this drawing and interview made me reconsider all of the data I generated up until the time I met this 11-year-old who produced this data and who I've named Jordan. How Jordan shared something with me that surprised me in a big way, and how I use the surprise analytically. So Jordan explained to me that he fell while he was skating. He was taken to the emergency room, assessed by a physician, and told that he did not have a concussion. Now, prior to encountering this data, through my interactions with the literature and my clinical knowledge of pediatric concussion, I thought or assumed that it was the physical injury, the symptoms of concussion, and the continued interactions with the healthcare system that shaped how young people experience concussion. Learning that Jordan was not diagnosed with a concussion, did not experience those symptoms, the interactions with the healthcare system, changed my thinking in two important ways. First, I began to think about the experience of concussion not as the experience of physical injury, but as the experience, or not only of physical injury, but as the experience of being immersed in the social world where talk of concussion abounds. Second, I began to pay more attention to data produced by all children, including those without a history of concussion. They were immersed in the same social world that Jordan was. What could they or their data tell me about that world? When I looked back to the data set with this new interest in the social world and in how this had an effect on who children were allowed to be, I began to see things quite differently. I wondered how and why Jordan became cautious. What was it that caused him to react in this way, to shrink back from the recording device when he spoke of his experience? What was he being told, either directly or indirectly, about his position in the world, about the expectations that came with that position? You'll recall that he used the word threat, which drew me to start thinking about the closely related word or concept of risk. I began reading about risk discourse and about how notions of choice, blame, and responsibility are so closely related to risk. And then I began seeing risk and responsibility everywhere. I began to see the effect of these discourses on children. With specific regard to Jordan, I began reading his data for risk and responsibility. I began seeing his caution not as an emotional or fear-based reaction to his injury experience or to skating, but as an expectation that he, an inherently and perpetually at-risk child, act responsibly, be responsible. It was his experience with concussion as a social rather than a biomedical phenomenon that had this effect on him. This new direction was exciting to me because I knew I was onto something, but I also knew that I needed to further develop my theoretical framework to account for discourse and subjectivity, revisit my method, attending to how I regarded drawing. What did I think drawing could offer my work over qualitative inquiry more generally? How did I intend to treat drawing analytically? How did drawing data fit with interview data? Did it offer just more data or a different kind of data? I needed to go back and ask different questions of my data, not what does this child understand, but again, how has this child come to understand concussion in this way? I also needed to look across the data set and ask, what is the story of this data? Which leads to my provocation, the challenge I'm grappling with today, and that I invite you to weigh in on, that I've phrased as a question that likely has no answer or no one answer that I've landed on. Do we need words? This next drawing is my study's namesake, Freaked Out by Pediatric Concussion. I can still see myself with this child in the research encounter and picture exactly how our interaction played out. Due to time constraints, I didn't have the opportunity to interview this child. And I won't get into the details of the setting, et cetera, because we just don't have time. But this participant did give me permission to use the drawing, even though I didn't have an accompanying interview. Of all the drawings generated in my doctoral work, this is the one that I come back to the most, the one with no interview. the one I thought I couldn't use because it didn't fit with what I was reading about drawing as method. That it had to be, and what I was reading is that drawings had to be accompanied by word-based data, either in the form of an interview or written explanation of the drawing produced by the child. Because if we didn't have this words-based data, how could we know what the child really meant? How could we know the truth of the drawing? How could I, as an analyst, avoid misrepresenting or misinterpreting this data, projecting my analysis, interpretation, and assumptions onto it? How could I avoid speaking for the child? In the end, I did use this drawing because those reasons that were holding me back didn't fit or make sense for me and my onto-epistemological assumptions. Those reasons for requiring words-based data didn't sit well with me and still don't sit well with me, implying that words-based data, what a participant chooses to share about their drawing through words, provides a window onto the drawing, an authentic truth about that drawing that cannot be known otherwise. This thinking is problematic in at least two related ways. First, it implies that words-based data requires less interpretive investment than visual data, that words about drawings somehow speak for themselves. Second, it implies that visual data is somewhat impenetrable without words. And perhaps this is true if we don't talk about and think deeply about and write about how to read visual data, if we don't theorize our method. And so I returned to how I regarded the data in my study, the visual and the spoken, not as providing a window onto the truth of concussion, but as constructed in a specific time and place, as analyzable and interpretable, as shaped by and shaping discourse. Now, this is not mind-bending stuff, but it is onto epistemological stuff that we need to consider even with this cute method. And this onto epistemological stuff must be coherent throughout a study. We need good reasons to take up drawing as method, reasons that extend beyond enhancing the innovative status of a study. We must think about what we believe drawing can add to the examination of our topic beyond qualitative inquiry more generally. We must attend to how drawings might work with other forms of data, and we must consider in advance if possible, which is not what I did, how we will treat drawings, how we will analyze and interpret them, and how our plans fit with our understandings of truth, reality, and knowledge. And finally, once we've done all that, we must engage with our community of practice, discuss these ideas openly in forums such as this, and write, so that visuals do not remain impenetrable or worse, just cute. Thank you. That's it for me, Polly, for now.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Katie. I've just been following a bit in the chat here. We haven't even opened up the discussion yet, and there's lots of people already weighing in about being excited about what you're speaking about today, and also super supportive of the work that you're doing and the questions that you have. So, and thank you for leaving this with some wonderful questions. So what I'd like to do now is to open it up to the discussion and questions and answers. If you wouldn't mind putting your hand up, if possible, we'll call on you, and Tenzin's going to help me track that. You could also, if you don't feel comfortable putting your hand up and turning your camera on when you ask Katie a question, then please feel free to put your question in the chat box, and we'll get to you. So we've got a nice long, good 30 minutes here to discuss. So we will get started here. I see a couple of people's hands. Just let me see if I can track whose hands came up first. Okay. So let's see. Azumi, wonderful. If you wouldn't mind turning your camera on if you can for your question, just so Katie can see you, that would be super.
Thank you. But I think Giselle had the hand up first.
That's okay. You can go ahead. I can go after. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It was really fascinating, and how your careful attention to theory and really grounding the methodology in theory as you went back and forth with the reflexivity and try to do ethical and rigorous work and pushing back on people who try to dismiss your methodology and focus. So that was really
Thank you.
wonderful. As somebody, I also do arts-based research, so I resonated with many of the potential critiques from outside as well as in my own head. So thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so the question I have is, have you had a chance to go back to the people who participated, kids who participated, and if so, what kinds of reactions have they had, and also what did you actually share? Thanks.
Sure. I love that question, and it's something that I really grappled with early on in my work. So I didn't share much, or I didn't share anything about the setting, but I did mention that during my doctoral work, I was affiliated with a large concussion lab at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehab, and we had an opportunity to generate data at the Ontario Science Centre. They used to run exhibits and then, science exhibits, and then have studies that were related to that topic. So there was an exhibit on the brain, and then my study took place in that setting. And so I only had one interaction with the participants. At first, I thought, especially because I was initially entering into drawing and wanting to use it as a participatory method, and I wanted that continued engagement with the participants, I really worried that I wouldn't sort of have enough to work with. So I think that answers your question part. So I didn't have that continued engagement. I haven't been able to go back to them. And I do wish that I had that ability, but I don't. That said, the way that I then went back and theorized my method enabled the analysis that I did produce, even without that continued engagement. But it was absolutely a worry that I had at the outset of my study. Thank you for that question.
Sorry, if I could do a follow-up. So have you thought about sort of cross-sectional kind of approach? So bringing the results to different group of kids who have had concussions, and then how they may respond to that?
Yeah, I've actually had the opportunity to share. So I wish I had some visuals to show you. I constructed the drawing data into a public art installation or gallery of sorts that was constructed as sort of a corridor that people could walk through with prompts written on sort of tiles on the floor, just to help them think through what they were seeing and how they were thinking about the data. And I've been able to share that in a couple of different venues to mixed audiences, including young people with concussion, parents, clinicians, and scientists. And it's something that I would like to continue doing, because it was really that audience reaction that helped me in my analysis and sort of pointed me where to look and showed me what resonated with people.
Thanks, Katie. That sounds amazing. It would be beautiful to see that sometime. Sorry about that, Giselle. I missed you. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much for this talk, Dr. Ma. You asked very interesting questions and left us with an important provocation that I've myself been thinking about a lot. My doctoral research is on cognitive disability diagnoses, and I'm thinking about arts-based methods as a way of creating more accessible research, but also kind of challenging the ideas around who constitutes a proper research subject. Because if we think of research, it's always the speaking subject, the one who can articulate. But what about those who do not want to or cannot articulate their self-understandings and respond to things? So this final provocation about looking at pictures and kind of trying to escape the temptation to analyze the picture and kind of speak for the subject, I think is something that's really weighing on my mind as I think about it. But also kind of maybe challenging the idea that we need language to make sense, but how can we think beyond that? So I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to how you think about this provocation yourself in your work. Yeah.
Thank you. That sounds like really, really interesting work. And it is something that I do grapple with, and I think that I'll answer it in a couple different ways. First, I would direct you to, I know that she's on this line right now, to Dr. Gail Teachman's work, if you haven't already encountered, because I feel like she'll have some interesting insights into sort of those questions about who can articulate, who cannot, how we regard data produced by those participants, and how we might do things differently. So that would be sort of one point. And the other in my own work is that I think, again, it just comes back to looking across the data. So if that drawing that I shared, that freaked out drawing, were not in the context of a larger study, I would have struggled to read into it what I did. But having looked across all of the data, it really spoke to what I was seeing in data produced by other participants. So it was really that interaction between all of the texts, and just that idea that if I hadn't conceptualized my data through discourse and understood that circulating nature of discourse and the way that it produces particular ways of thinking and knowing and being, I wouldn't have been able to analyze that one piece of data in isolation. These are issues that I'm also just sort of starting to think about, so I haven't thought about them out of the context of my own study, but that would be an interesting sort of place to go next, I think. Bigger questions.
Thanks, Katie. There's a question from Catherine, who's got her hand up, and then I might jump to the chat for a couple before I head back, but we'll start with Catherine there.
Oh, thank you. This has been so fascinating. I mean, it's just such great information, and I'm wondering how this could be applied to children experiencing trauma, and my particular interest is in children who experience grief, especially like maladaptive grief. And
okay.
do you think that the drawing would be, I mean, it seems to me like it could give very valuable information, especially with the younger ones, because it's harder for them to articulate perhaps what they're feeling. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that, yeah, again, I think it would come back to thinking about sort of how and why you would be using drawing. And it sounds like you have some beginning thoughts on why that would be already. For me, and I spoke to this just briefly, but I really appreciated it. It took the pressure I felt of an immediate response off of young people, like might be expected with words-based data. So if I'm sitting face to face with a participant and asking a question, they may feel the need to respond right away, which could be, not that we can ever sort of undo the power imbalances in a research relationship, but that could be a situation where that differential is felt a little bit more heavily. And so I appreciated that drawing gave the time and space to young people to reflect on this topic that is abstract, like grief would be. And so I think it could be really interesting in that regard, for sure. Yeah, and it sounds like you're thinking about it not just as sort of innovation, but for some of those more meaningful reasons and the sort of the knowledge that would be produced through that process.
Yeah, because you said something about, if I'm understanding it correctly, about discourse, and I'm thinking, especially with grief, I read this absolutely awesome paper just recently, and it was assessing what the children heard about the death versus what the caregiver told the therapist. Mm-hmm. And often parents will try to shield children, or they don't want to give them the full truth. And when the children don't know that, they don't adapt well at all because they sense something is off. And so I was just thinking, you know, sometimes maybe in a picture, like you say with a drawing, you might get a glimpse of this dichotomy between what really happened and what they heard. And I know that that could cause a lot of problems with the kids. So yeah, so this is just absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, there's a few more hands up, but I'm just going to jump to the chat here. So, Katie, somebody was asking, let's see, Sarah Pedersen, did you feel comfortable interpreting the drawings, or were there times when you asked others for their interpretations?
That's a great question. So I'll say that when I thought that I would feel comfortable interpreting drawings, and now I feel comfortable interpreting drawings. But I do remember taking an early analysis to my committee, and I don't know if I was called out on it or if I recognized it myself, but it was based largely in the interview data, even though I had all of this drawing data. And so I did experience that hesitancy that I see sometimes when drawing is written about as method of how do we go about interpreting this. And I think part of the reason that I had that difficulty is that there is writing about it, but I think that area is just expanding now. And so I hope that if we can continue to write about how and why we use our methods, and particularly about that analysis piece, that fear or that hesitancy might change down the road. I did, again, by going back to my theory and my theoretical framework and developing that further, I did sort of gain that comfort in analyzing the drawing data and treating it, you know, not that dissimilarly from how I would treat interview data. So not taking it at face value and looking for that discourse and looking for how young people were presenting themselves to me and how they were being constituted in particular ways in their daily lives. I didn't really go, other than speaking with my committee, I didn't really go to others to ask them how they interpreted the drawing, because I know that just with any other form of data, we all bring our own lens to the data, and so we'll interpret it differently. But I will say that I did, in showing my data publicly, or the drawings publicly, I did pay close attention to how other people responded to the drawings and the discussions that came out of that. So I remember presenting an early analysis in an analysis course that I was taking with Brenda, and being really drawn to talk of childhood innocence, which really sort of led me to look at that vulnerability piece and develop the pediatric concussion discourse through that. So thank you for that question.
Super. Liz Harvey has her hand up.
Yes.
Hi there.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well, how are you?
Good. Thanks, Katie. I am a doctoral student and I'm just in my proposal phase. So, and I'm looking at doing an arts-based method as well. So I have to say this was affirming for me and also inspirational to see somebody could actually complete it and be at the other end. So I appreciate that very much. But back to your question about do words matter? I was thinking about how the temporal location of your drawing, and I was wondering about, because the way I've envisioned mine is a little bit differently in the timing of it, and I wondered if that would change or modify or influence your question about do words matter? So you had the drawing first and then you spoke about it and tell me about your drawing sort of thing. And I'm looking at doing an interview and then doing a drawing. And the drawing in the context is sort of what Izumi is talking about here in a focus group. So then the focus group being reacting to people's drawings and kind of opening up the discussion more. So while I agree with what you were talking about when you showed this fearful, it freaks me out drawing, and then, do you really need words for that? I just wondered if the temporal location of the drawing would be influential on whether you thought you needed the words, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting to consider, because it sounds like, so I use the drawing as an elicitation device for the interview, or that's how I initially conceptualized it. Now I think of it as more than an elicitation device, because I did, it really opened up my analysis rather than just serving as a tool for the interview that followed. And it sounds like the way that you are thinking about it is, again, as that elicitation device, and really to generate that conversation. So I think that in that context, it might be different. But I think I'd have to give it a little bit more thought. I think that in that case, the words would matter, because it sounds to me like it's the words that you're after, and that the drawing is eliciting those words. But maybe I'm understanding wrong.
Maybe I don't understand it yet. I don't understand it yet either. So, this is all in the proposed stage. So I think I'm very interested in seeing your journey like that, in your squiggly lines, and anticipating that mine will have a similar squiggly line. So thank you for that.
I think if we just all had straight lines, we'd be missing out on a lot. We might be ignoring those sort of things that are nagging at us. But best of luck.
Thanks, Kate. I totally agree. If we weren't squiggling, we wouldn't be here, because we're all over that. Well, Joan Eakin has her hand up, and as she is who this award is sort of named after and dedicated to, we should give her some space. Hey, Joan.
Hi, Joan.
Hi there, Katie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I loved your presentation. Thank you so much. It was you beautifully put to rest the view that your method was just cute. Really, I think you made a very, very strong case for that. And of course, that's so symbolic of qualitative research more generally, because qualitative research is regarded as a kind of quaint or cute kind of approach to things. So you were kind of enacting that defense, I think, more globally for qualitative research. But what I wanted to ask you about it, as you know, I've always said that everything is data, and I'm interested in the epistemological and the status and the interpretive possibilities of all kinds of data. And I certainly learned a lot from hearing you talk about arts-based, because I hadn't thought about many of the things you're talking about. So it was really interesting for me to hear that. I was wondering if you, in your work with kids' concussion or any other area, have thoughts about other kinds of data, not arts-based, but other kinds of data that maybe have potential or some reason to look at through the same kind of a lens and thoughtful methodological approach that you've taken, that you've come across, that might be like the emergence of arts-based data, that might be the next thing on the horizon for things that there's observation, there's other kinds of things, but I wondered what you have, if you had any thoughts on that, other kinds of data.
I don't at present, but now I'm going to be thinking about it, I think, a lot. It's very interesting, because anything that I've considered using that I also think has the same potential would probably be classified as arts or visual data. So I think I'll have to give that one some thought. But I'm wondering, sorry.
You said that you were kind of saying that words are viewed as easier to, words compared to drawings, for example, that the interpretive act was, for sure. Words themselves are unbelievably problematic to understand, and art is as well. But I think observations observations, how do we interpret them as well? And I was even thinking, as a grandmother with 7 kids that are running around being potential concussion candidates all the time, I was interested substantively in what you were saying. I was thinking of my own kids, grandkids, and how I could think about their grasp of concussion, because it's definitely there. And I think in their behaviors, in what they do, in the clothing they might wear, protective clothing. Do you put on the pads? Do you whatever? How do you represent yourself as a kid that is responsible for being careful? I mean, parents are always after their children to be careful and transferring that responsibility. I bet there could be an awful lot said and heard by observing things, just for example. But I mean, those are challenges. I'm not saying you should have done that at all. I'm just saying that the broader value and interest of what you've done is to make larger the range of things that we can consider as data, that there's potential for how to interpret, how to understand them. So really, thank you, Katie. It was a really lovely presentation.
Thank you, Joan.
Thanks, Joan. If I can just hop on that conversation, because I also am really interested in risk, and in particular, the discourse that I've engaged with is with older adults, which interestingly is quite similar in terms of the fear, and what society says older adults can and can't and should and shouldn't do in terms of taking risk. And I'm thinking about this drawing data and wondering if, because kids draw all the time. In fact, they're encouraged and in some times made to draw, right? At school, that's the assignment. Right. And we lose that and are not encouraged, most of us, unless we're playing Pictionary, to draw. And I'm thinking about, is this better suited, do you think, to young people, or what do you think about that? Or is this something with older adults? Would this be similarly rich? I'm thinking about my own drawings, maybe not just older adults, just adults.
I really appreciate that question, because I think that yes, it would be as rich with other populations. I think that sometimes it's used with children and young people because we assume it to be child friendly without actually thinking about what that means, and maybe without thinking about how we're going to use that data and what we're going to do with that data. I think that even having that question means that more will be done with that data. Just being aware that, well, from my perspective, I don't think that any method is inherently child friendly. I think it's what you do with that method, just as I don't think that any method inherently gives voice, or think of lots of other examples, I'm sure. But I think it's what you do with that method. So yes, I do think that it would be as rich. I also do have some experience generating drawing data with adults, and specifically with clinicians and researchers. So I haven't analyzed this data, and I don't know that I will get to, but when I constructed that corridor of the drawings, I actually generated data with the audience members about how they were understanding pediatric concussion after viewing these drawings generated by young people. Because of the audience, they were all very interested and invested or working in the area of youth concussion. I wasn't sure that they'd be comfortable generating data. Many of them were scientists and quantitative scientists. And so I gave them the option to draw or to write. And all but one chose to draw. And I was surprised. I was pleasantly surprised. And there were no bar graphs. They were different types of drawing. And I'd love to dive into that data. But yeah, I think that people, they find it freeing, and they find it's just the innovation of it draws them in. But then that process of drawing, I think, gives them something more and helps them think about the topic in a different way and construct knowledge about that topic in a different way.
Cool. I think that's super. And as Joan says, everything is data. So what are either inabilities or insecurities about drawing tells us something, of course, in and of itself. So I appreciate that in the answer. I encourage me to think on that. So we've got a few more minutes for questions. Please feel free to put your hand up. I'll just go to the chat here because there's something coming in. This is from Michael Snyder, who's been posting a little bit, and he says, coming from a nutrition and food background, I think exploring what food insecurity means to children and families who are experiencing it through their drawings could potentially produce some interesting data. And additionally, exploring what health and healthy relationships with food, or assessing what critical food literacy skills means to specific research participants through drawing would be very interesting. They say they're just thinking out loud, but I don't know if you have any comments about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there have been a few questions about, would this work with this topic, or would this work with this population? And I just want to say yes to everything, but with an asterisk, in that it depends how you think through it and how you're using it, and that just make sure that you're giving that thought that it deserves. And I think that if you're in this room, then you would be. I think that you're interested in method, you're interested in theory, you're interested in how to do more with data, I hope. And so I mean, I see it being used with many populations and with many concepts or topics of inquiry, as long as the appropriate regard is given to analysis and interpretation. I think that would sort of be my final word on it, is we need to do something with that data, not just sort of use it at face value, just as you would do with words-based data. So it really is not dissimilar in that many ways. I think there definitely are some differences, and I don't know that we have time to get into all of those right now, but I think that with the same regard needs to be given to an analysis and interpretation, and we also need to make sure that we're doing rigorous work, even with innovative or child-friendly methods.
Super. Just before, Brenda's got her hand up. Brenda, if it's okay, if you wait just 1 minute, because I think it might be nice to kind of close it off with you. But there's a quick question in the chat about procedural questions. So do you use software at all in your data analysis? And if so, do what? And I might add to that, why not, if you don't?
Okay. I have not. I'm a very visual learner, and for me, that visual requires me to put pen to paper. My analysis was like literally cutting and pasting, and huge wall full of. I need to see those connections, and I need to see them in real life, I guess you could say. I mean, I did use some digital strategies more just to manage large amounts of data that I had. So creating an Excel sheet with sort of, the participant number, a brief description of their drawing, how I was starting to think about it analytically, so that I could sort of connect different pieces of data, or just recall who said what or who drew what. But by and large, my process was very much pen to paper.
Awesome. Love it. Just before we go to you, Brenda, Joan, you still have your hand up. I don't know if that's a legacy hand or if you have, no. Okay, awesome. I love it. You're just encouraging and cheering. So I think we'll just end today. We'll let Brenda maybe ask the last question or make the last comment. Take it away, Brenda.
Thanks, Polly. It wasn't my intention to have the last word. I'm going to give Katie the last word, but I do have a couple of quick questions. One is, what could people do in the more ubiquitous method of interviewing, which most people use, given what you've learned from the reflection that arts-based work allows the participant to do? Is there a way that we could interview people and allow or foster or encourage the same kind of reflection and thinking about what they think about what they think, even if you're not using arts-based work? So do you interview differently as a person who does drawings with people?
Interesting. I think that, and I'm going to start talking and it's going to bring me to an answer, as you know that sometimes I do.
Yes, I know you will. Yes. I'm on the journey with you.
What I appreciate about an interview, or let me start with what you can't see in a drawing, is the back and forth that people go through in producing that drawing, how they're thinking about the topic changes as they're producing that drawing, how they're producing knowledge about it, how they're putting their assumptions to paper. You can't see all of that thought that goes into it. When being in an interview or when looking to a transcript of an interview, you can see that back and forth. You can see how thinking changes while in the field, while in interaction with the researcher. You can see that co-construction of knowledge. And so I think that we need to be mindful of that in the interview, that and not be afraid to probe, I guess, would be sort of the piece there. Like what the person says right off the bat is maybe it's a nice invitation into the topic, but I wouldn't say it's the final word. And so I think we need to have those conversations that allow us to go a little bit deeper. I do wonder if I interview differently. I'm not sure. I think that a lot of my interviewing skills, while it's not the same as clinical practice, I think that my interviewing skills do draw a lot on my clinical background as a nurse and an occupational therapist. And that probing and knowing that when you're meeting a person and they're not at their best and you're at their bedside, that it takes time to develop that rapport, and it takes time to let those conversations evolve and have sort of thinking evolve and that co-construction happen at the bedside just as it does in the interview. And so I think that perhaps because of those experiences, I do interview differently. And I think because of this experience with this study, I will interview differently going forward as well, just being more comfortable with silence, because I think that's one of the beautiful things about drawing is it gives that time and space for reflection. And when we're used to just, if we get uncomfortable and we jump in too fast, what is that doing to that interaction, and how is it cutting off what we could know, but that we don't, because it makes us uncomfortable.
I really like that. Thank you so much for journeying us through that thinking, like thinking out loud with us. And even the word elicitation can sound harsh in that sense, right? Compared to what you've just described. The second observation is just really quick. And I love your question, do we need words? And I think that's something we all need to be thinking about. But, you know, the child who did the stick figures needed words to explain, I'm being careful, I'm before I'm careful, like in the thought bubble, right? A lot of kids that I've done drawings and digital storytelling with also want to explain their pictures through adding words. So I think it's worth thinking about that. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that. I think we have talked about it, but you know, just that idea that do we need words? What are the answers that our participants give us in their desire to explain what they've drawn outside of an elicitation method?
Yeah, it's interesting because I almost need an asterisk on that question. And it would be interesting actually to look back through all of the drawing data and see, just for myself, how many do have words. And is that because that's sort of an expectation in school that we label our drawings? is it a desire to communicate to the researcher what it is that the participant is truly thinking? Is it because they think that that's needed to sort of enhance what they've drawn if they're not sort of confident in their skills? There's so many things that we could think about why those words are there.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to consider because they are there. And so it's not the same as interview data or sort of a more fulsome written description of the data, but those words can't be ignored. They're doing something.
Yes, they are. Thanks, Katie, very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Brenda. Wow, 90 minutes. It's gone. I'm sure, like everyone, my brain is on fire, and I wish I had another 90 minutes with Katie. But Tenzin has posted some links to Katie's work. There's lots of good supporting materials in the chat there, which I suggest you all go and have a look. But I just want to say a big thank you to Katie for just we know it takes a lot of work to put these together and to do so well. And we really appreciate your time and energy and the thought put into not just presenting your dissertation data, but helping us show where you've moved that work and also a little lens into where you're going with that. So that was just really beautifully done, and we really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody for coming. It was really great to see you. This is our last CQ seminar for this year. We look forward to seeing everybody in the fall. Stay tuned. And yeah, have a great day, everybody. And thanks again, Katie.
Thank you, Polly.